Just after 10 a.m., the Hyuga detected on her radar a large air formation, which was apparently the enemy on a bearing of 90 degrees, which meant due east of the Ozawa force, out about 170 miles. It could have been a Japanese force coming back from attack on the Americans. More likely, it was a strike from one of the carriers moving toward Luzon. Soon the contact was lost, but the alert was on. Ozawa ordered 3 planes put up immediately to serve as combat air patrol. A 3-plane combat air patrol was nothing. The Americans put up a dozen to do Jess work, but it was an indication of Ozawa's nagging problems. It cost him dearly in aviation gas to put up the patrol. It diminished his potential, fighting force, already so slim. And putting those pilots up there, he was not too sure that they would get down again safely, at least with their planes. So it was another agonizing decision. By 11:15 a.m., Ozawa had more information. Number 9 search plane from the coast reported that an enemy force of more than 10 combat ships had been sighted, although the weather was so bad that the observer could not tell precisely whether any carriers were involved. But a plane from Mactang Naval Air Base had definitely confirmed at least 2 carriers earlier, and of course so had the blips on the Hyuga's screen. As of 11:30 a.m., Admiral Ozawa and his staff were thinking this way: to launch an all-out air attack against the American task forces as cited by search plane number 9. Since the weather was so foul around the target, and knowing only too well that his pilots were inferior, it would be most unwise to ask them to fight and try to make it back to the carrier. So the pilots would attack, and then, because of the bad weather, they would be told to proceed to Nichols Field in the Manila area, or anywhere else they could put down. Later on, Ozawa would promise they would be recovered in the waters east of Luzon. That promise was a part of the charade Ozawa was playing for his men and for the Japanese world. He did not for a moment believe that he would ever recover those planes or pilots. He doubted very seriously if the Ozawa force would ever see Japan again, but he was an imperial naval officer, and defeat was unthinkable. Only the appurtenances of victory could be enunciated in orders. After launching, the force would proceed westward to recover planes, said Ozawa to his staff. But it was not really to recover planes that he would proceed west. It was to lure the American fleet north and keep the American planes from striking Admiral Kurita and the American fast battleships from blowing him out of the water. At 11:45 a.m. it was all settled and the planes were launched: 40 fighters, 28 carrier bombers, 2 reconnaissance, 6 carrier attack, 76 planes to wipe out the American fleet. As patiently as he could, Admiral Ozawa settled down to await results. He heard nothing. Of course, the orders he had delivered, to strike the Americans and then proceed to Philippine air bases, were less than perfect for intelligence purposes. And given the current very threadbare state of Japanese communications in the islands, there were excuses for delays. But not to hear anything at all from anyone. What he did finally hear was that the American task forces were on a bearing of 210 degrees, about 150 miles away. The direction had changed with his change in course, moving westward. What he also heard was that Kurita had been hit hard early in the morning. So Ozawa knew that the Americans knew Kurita was moving towards San Bernardino Strait and an attack on the ships in Leyte Gulf to stop the landings. Soon Ozawa had one bit of information. 3 planes came back to the carriers, landed and reported that they had been unable to find the enemy. Not very encouraging, nor was it encouraging to have nothing but silence about the fate of the others. By 2:30 p.m. Ozawa was feeling quite low, but with the resiliency of a great commander he began modifying his tactical plan. He knew that the attack must have failed, or he would have learned something. The mobile force main body, he said, so far has been ineffective in its action to divert the enemy. It is imperative, regardless of losses which this force may sustain, that the diversion of the enemy to the north be accomplished in support of the first striking force, Kurita. As a last resort, it is necessary to dispatch the advance guard carrier division 4 destroyer divisions, 61 and 41, to divert the enemy effectively in conjunction with air attacks and to attack enemy remnants. The advance group would consist of the hermaphrodite battleship Hyuga and Ice and 4 destroyers. They were sent out then to further the plan. 2 more planes were launched to maintain contact with the enemy until dark. Ozawa planned to steam west until 4 p.m. to make sure that the enemy knew he was there and move east. Actually, Ozawa was under the impression that the Americans knew where he was and had been for hours. He said later that he personally saw the American airplane that sighted his force on the morning of October 24. If so, the American plane never reported the sighting to the 7th or 3rd Fleets because no one knew where Ozawa was until evening. Ozawa's frustrations continued. He had sent out planes, but by 5:25 p.m. he had to note that no report had been received from the planes. Had they been shot down? Perhaps they had been forced to land in the Philippines. If they went near the Americans, they were probably shot down. The sinking of the Princeton had the American combat air patrols buzzing around those carriers like a hive of angry bees. If they did not find the carriers, the weather was bad enough to discourage the most experienced pilots. As far as the airstrike of Ozawa's fleet is concerned, it remains a mystery. The first planes, a flight of 30 fighters, 19 fighter bombers, 4 torpedo planes, and 5 attack planes were launched from the carriers Zuiho, Chiyoda, and Chitose. So small a force from so many carriers, the second group, launched a few minutes later, came from the Zuikaku. This force, according to Masanori Ito, the Japanese historian, actually did attack the Americans. But if so, what did it accomplish? There were some near misses that day, some damage to landing ship tanks and other ships, but no capital ship sinkings except for the Princeton, and that ship was damaged very early in the day, obviously by a shore-based plane. No, the Japanese air forces were not working effectively on October 24, either from land or from sea. Their intelligence reports were fragmentary and inaccurate, probably again reflecting the bad weather and the inadequate training of the pilots who were fighting through the squalls. What they did note, with some accuracy perhaps, was that the Second Air Fleet on the morning of October 24 consisted of about 200 planes of various types. On the night of the 24th, having been augmented by what was left of Ozawa's force after it attacked the enemy, the Second Air Fleet claimed 102 planes left. Considering Ozawa's 70-odd planes, and the fact that the army must have had some planes to put in the air that day, the claims of Admiral Halsey's boys for 150 or more planes seem to be understated rather than overstated, but perhaps the Japanese lost a great many to weather that day. Whatever the reason, it could be seen at the end of the day that the way the Japanese were going, they would not accomplish anything with their air forces, and even Admiral Fukudome came to the conclusion that Admiral Onishi's kamikaze plan was the only way. On the night of October 24, the Japanese air commanders surveyed their slender resources and began discussing the establishment of a single unified naval air command in the Philippines to use the kamikaze tactics. But just after 4 p.m. the Japanese had one minor satisfaction, if a negative one. Ozawa's force sighted one American Curtiss plane and knew from listening to the transmission that the report was out that Ozawa existed. At last, thankful as he was, Ozawa was not chicken-hearted toward the American. He sent up 2 fighters, but the American plane made its way off through the clouds and apparently back to its carrier. With great satisfaction, Admiral Ozawa sent a message off to the combined fleet, to Kurita, and to everyone else who might be interested. Everyone knew what Ozawa had now to do. Just before 6 p.m., the cruiser Tama reported the presence on her screens of more than 20 planes, presumably enemy, on a bearing of 300. Ozawa was not sure what it was. Probably this was a late afternoon strike from Clark Field or an American strike force returning, but he did not want to be hit by carrier planes just then. He knew that the Americans would or should follow him north to wipe him out, and so he headed north to escape those planes and lure the American carriers away from their attention to San Bernardino Strait. Here was his plan. Operations will be carried out as scheduled in accordance with Combined Fleet Decipord, Order to Lure. Will proceed on 140 degrees course, and at 6 a.m. will send off all remaining air strength to renew air action. Every effort will be made to draw off the forces attacking Second Fleet Kurita. The naval order sounded very impressive, until one stopped to realize that Admiral Ozawa's planes, on all his carriers, could now be counted by 2 men on the fingers of their hands, give or take a few toes. Some 20 planes left to take on the American fleet. If nothing else, Ozawa's was an exercise in pure courage. It was not long after this order that Ozawa received information that confused him and caused a change in his plan. Around 8 p.m. came the delayed report that Kurita had turned around and was retiring from the enemy until he had some information that someone else was doing something to stop the Americans. After all, Kurita knew no planes had helped him that day, and he did not know what Ozawa was doing. There was something plaintive in the section of the Kurita message. Resumption of advance should depend on results achieved by friendly air forces, even though by the time Ozawa got the message, Kurita was already moving back into action. There was something plaintive and shocking about the whole show operation, with its puerile communications network, and the combination of despair and wild hope with which the Japanese sought their miracles. When Ozawa and his staff considered Kurita's action, they were thoroughly upset. Despite the order from Combined Fleet Headquarters directing all forces to advance to the attack, the above dispatch from 2nd Fleet on retirement indicates that it had already reversed course at the time and retired a considerable distance. Since this action creates great danger of the mobile force's main body becoming isolated, the entire force is being ordered to reverse course temporarily to the north. So Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda and the Issei and the Hyuga were recalled from what was definitely a suicide mission, and the Ozawa force headed north. By 9 p.m., however, Admiral Ozawa had had plenty of time for second thoughts, and he realized that no matter what Kurita did, he still had his own responsibility. Further, he was made considerably happier to receive Combined Fleet's direct order to Kurita to get back into action, so Admiral Ozawa made a new estimate of the situation. The enemy's action today shows that he is fully aware of the operational objective of the first striking force, Kurita, and has therefore concentrated his attacks on this force. In view of the threat posed by First Striking Force's operations, it is very probable that the enemy on the 25th will again concentrate on that force. Therefore, the Mobile Force Main Body, in accordance with Mobile Force Main Body Operation Order No. 1, will risk its own existence and carry out diversionary operations at all costs. In cooperation with the First Striking Force's penetration, the main body will advance to the southeast in preparation for operations tomorrow morning, and then Ozawa issued a fleet disposition order. Of the force, only the Kiri was detached. This destroyer was running low on fuel and was sent to Amami-Oshima to refuel, and then find the fleet again, and the supply force was having its troubles. At about the time that Ozawa was fretting over his course of action, believing that Kurita was abandoning the action, the Akikaze and her little contingent were hearing things, specifically transmissions they suspected came from enemy submarines. The transmissions began just after dark and continued long into the night. The Akikaze was on the alert and began making sonar contact with what must be submarines. She went out on search patterns, and so did escort number 31. They tried evasion patterns, but the sonar pings continued, those ominous little noises that sent shivers down the back of a tanker man and tears of frustration to the eyes of destroyer men who could not move within range. Then, at 4:45 a.m. on October 25, it came. The little force was heading for Amami-Oshima and had reached 30° 15 minutes north, 129° 45 minutes east. The pings grew louder and more insistent. Wham, 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 came 3 torpedoes that smashed into the side of the Jinai Maru. Up she went in a blaze of precious fuel oil, and in a few minutes she sank to the bottom. In seconds the men of the Akikaze were on the alert, searching through the darkness that seemed ever so much blacker than usual in the blinding light of the Jinai Maru's death fire. She and escort number 31 began charging across the sea toward the point where the torpedoes must have originated, and there they found nothing. They set to work to try to find and trap the crew of the American submarine. Meanwhile, Admiral Matsuda was still moving south against the Americans. He had gone off to the south, believing that the Americans had suffered damage to 2 carriers, and that only 1 carrier and 2 battleships remained in fighting condition. It was supposed that his force could cope with them. Matsuda was no fool. He was doing as he was told, but he had no personal hopes, none at all, that he would emerge alive from this battle. About 8 p.m., Matsuda and his men observed some flashes of light in the distance. What they might be, nobody knew. He thought they might be gunfire from the land fighting, or perhaps even sheet lightning or an electrical storm. He paralleled the course and steamed on, searching for American forces, keyed up with determination to have a night battle. So great was the tension in this little force that had been sent to spend itself against the Americans, that when Ozawa ordered Admiral Matsuda to turn around and rejoin him, calling off the banzai attack he had ordered, Matsuda did not immediately respond. He kept steaming, kept looking for Americans, and if the flashes he had seen were American ships, he would close with them around 9 p.m., and he was determined to fight if there was a chance to do so. But the flashes never materialized as anything identifiable, and before midnight he must either obey Ozawa's orders or decide to disobey them. He chose to obey, and reluctantly turned and sped north to rejoin his chief, meeting the Ozawa force just before sunrise on October 25, and joining up in the prescribed formation. If the Japanese conduct of the show operation was confused and sorely hurt by the failure in communications facilities, still, one must say that the American conduct of the riposte to the show operation was equally sorely hurt by human failures in communications, and by assumptions based on the excellence of the American communications network. There, too, was a failure in the American riposte, certain assumptions made by certain intelligent and brave officers of the American fleet. If one is to assess the difficulties that began piling up on October 24 in the conduct and riposte of the show operation, the two sides, Japanese and American, both suffered from a lack of coordination of their naval forces. Usually, in a battle, each side has a commander. But in this battle, as it shaped up, the Japanese had at least 4 commanders in the field. Admiral Kurita in charge of the pincers movement, with Admiral Nishimura supposedly under his command, and Admiral Shima, who was independent of everyone for practical purposes, Admiral Ozawa, who wished he could coordinate with Kurita or someone, and Admiral Fukudome in charge of the 2nd Air Fleet, who would take command of all air operations in the Philippines on the following day. Loosely coordinating this as much as anyone was Admiral Toyoda in Japan. At least he coordinated the Japanese effort enough to be sure that Kurita kept moving forward through San Bernardino Strait, and that Ozawa, who was ready to throw in the sponge at one point, knew that Kurita had moved back to the attack. In a way, that was better coordination than anything that happened among the Americans at the command level. Admiral Nimitz was in charge of the strategy of the Third Fleet, and General MacArthur was in charge of the invasion of the Philippines, and neither of these commanders did anything by October 24 that in any way affected the tactical maneuver, so the 2 important naval units, the 3rd and 7th Fleets. If the 7th and 3rd Fleets had exchanged high-ranking officers at the fleet staff level for this operation, and had the officers been totally familiar with the thinking of their respective admirals, the conduct of the battle might have been considerably different. What was to happen within the next few hours in the Philippines was very much a matter of character and communications. What was to happen otherwise was very much a matter of national character and individual bravery on the part of thousands of men. In the afternoon, when it was known that the Japanese were moving up through the Sulu Sea and that the forces the reader knows as those of Nishimura and Shima would come through the Surigao Strait and try to strike at the American ships in Leyte Gulf, then Admiral Kincaid began to put together the pieces of the Japanese plan. He sent a message to all his forces, with copies to Halsey, Nimitz, all the commanders of the task groups of the Third Fleet, Admiral King in Washington, and General MacArthur, warning of fighting to come, prepare for night engagement. Enemy force estimated 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 10 destroyers reported under attack by our carrier planes in eastern Sulu Sea at 12:10 a.m. 24 October, which was about 9 a.m. local time. Enemy may arrive Leyte Gulf tonight. Make all preparations for the night engagement. Task Group 77.3 assigned to Commander Task Group 77.2 as reinforcement, Barkey's battleships to Oldendorf. Commander Task Group 70.1, PT boats, station maximum number PTs lower Surigao Strait to remain south of 10° north during darkness. It was obvious since this message came early in the day that Admiral Kincaid was alert to the dangers, that he was confident of the ability of his battleships, cruisers, and escort carriers to stop the Nishimura and Shima threat. As for Halsey, he made arrangements in mid-afternoon for the independence of Admiral Bogen's task group to put out night fighters and search planes just before dark to watch the enemy and report on them. In mid-afternoon, Admiral Halsey directed a message to his fleet commanders, with copies to Admiral King in Washington and Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. Battle Plan: Battleship Division 7 Miami, Vincennes, Biloxi, Destroyer Squadron, 52 less Stephen Potter. From Task Group 38.2 and Washington, Alabama, Wichita, New Orleans, Destroyer Division 100, Patterson, Bagley from Task Group 38.4 will be formed as Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee, Commander Battle Line. Task Force 34 engage decisively at long ranges. Commander Task Group 38.4 conduct carriers of Task Group 38.2 and Task Group 38.4 clear of surface fighting. Instructions for Task Group 38.3 and Task Group 38.1 later. Halsey, Officers Training Corps in New Jersey. As far as Halsey and his staff were concerned, this message simply established the manner in which Admiral Lee and the surface force would operate if it came to a surface engagement. Had Admiral Matsuda continued south that afternoon, and had he succeeded in coming close enough for a night engagement? Then Lee would have been detached with Task Force 34, as it was known, and would have taken on Matsuda, his 2 battleships, and lesser ships for a fight. Or had Admiral Kurita not turned around and headed back toward Brunei that afternoon in full sight of the carrier planes which reported on the fact? Then Admiral Lee would have been standing off San Bernardino Strait, ready to fire on the Japanese vessels as they came through. Meanwhile, all kinds of things were happening. One was that Admiral Kincaid was an unknown party to this message, and he drew some conclusions. Good old Halsey was doing exactly what he should do, establishing the battle line and Lee's command for the future. It was a logical, perfect plan, said Kincaid. The reason it seemed to be perfect was that Halsey indicated he would keep 2 of the new battleships, Massachusetts and South Dakota, with the task force, and leave the ones sighted with the Lee force, which apparently would be left in the Leyte vicinity. But what seemed to escape Admiral Kincaid's thinking was the fact that the New Jersey, Admiral Halsey's flagship, was a part of Battleship Division 7, which had been assigned to Lee. And to think that Halsey would assign himself out of a chase after the Japanese fleet carriers, if he could find them, was to give Halsey a role quite outside his previous character. That afternoon, as the information poured in about the forces in the south, Kincaid and his staff counted noses. They knew that Kurita had 5 battleships with him, and they discovered by noon that Nishimura had 2 battleships. So they deduced that if another force was coming down from the north, it would have 2 battleships. The Isa and the Hyuga were the only battleships left that could be out hunting trouble. That afternoon in the New Jersey's flag plot, Admiral Halsey and his staff pondered the reports as they came in. It was apparent that his boys had been making a lot of hits on the Japanese. He was sure that their fire control and communications had taken serious damage that day. And when he heard that Kurita had turned around and was steaming back westward, he did not attempt to analyze the reason for Kurita's change. During the day, Admiral Davison responded to Halsey's order to close up the task force with the note that he would have to break off from Nishimura in order to do so, but Halsey, Admiral Kearney, and the staff of the Third Fleet had considered that. In reviewing Halsey's thinking of that day, Admiral Kearney had this to say: "To understand Halsey's decision, it is necessary to review the events of the 24th from the standpoint of the Third Fleet. The southern group, Davison, had located the enemy force coming in through Surigao Strait, accurately reported as 2 Fuso, battleships, apparently a Mogami, cruiser, and some small fry. They were damaged by the reinforced searches on contact. The centre force rounding Mindoro and heading through the Sibuyan Sea was formidable, and it was decided to concentrate on the centre force with the complete assurance that the piddling force they were risking in the Surigao Strait didn't have a chance against the forces which we knew the 7th Fleet had to meet them. So, throughout the day of the 24th, the strength of 3 carrier groups was concentrated on the centre force, and by 8 p.m. a reasonably good analysis of target coordinators' reports and photographs were available to the commander, 3rd Fleet. The assessment of Admiral Kearney, Halsey's Chief of Staff, was slightly different than that of his chief, made on a different basis. He and the other members of the staff agreed that the centre force kept coming forward, but they had received so much superficial damage that they were not in position to render the best account of themselves. Nor could they be strong enough to gain a decision even if they pressed through the San Bernardino Strait on toward the objective at Leyte. In Admiral Mitcher's flag plot aboard the Lexington, the thinking was on a slightly different level, as it would be for the commander of the carrier forces. The day had started with relatively little information and a general feeling of uneasiness. Of the 4 task groups, one, McCain's, was off on its way to Ulithi Atoll to replenish planes and supplies. The other 3 forces, and this was certainly true after the attack on the Princeton, which immobilized her almost immediately, felt that. They were just barely in position to do a job, and we were fighting again on a shoestring, said Commodore Arleigh Burke, Mitcher's chief of staff. He referred to the long period at which they had been at it, the attrition suffered since those early October days when the Third Fleet set out to cripple the Japanese, so they could not defend the Philippines properly. They had succeeded in that effort, but the cost had been heavy in airplanes and men, and in sleep. The problem of putting intelligence reports together was quite unlike reading the story of these actions in a book, where the results are known at least to historians. And it is so very easy to see who did what when and what here Ally ought to have done had he known precisely what the enemy was doing. Commodore Arleigh Burke gave a good feeling for the way it looked from the flag plot of the Lexington. They had started out in the morning with reports of Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea, and then almost immediately they had begun taking heavy air attack. Sherman's Task Group 38.3, in which Mitcher's flagship was stationed, took the brunt of the Japanese air attack all day long. First, in the morning and around noon, the attacks came from the west, but in the middle of the afternoon they started coming from the northeast, and Mitcher and Burke concluded it was very likely that these planes were coming from a carrier force off the Philippine coast. In past weeks, Mitcher and Burke had concluded that the Japanese were short on planes because of the many different types of planes they had encountered around Formosa. But they did not have Japanese production records at hand, or Admiral Onishi's reports on the paucity of planes in the Philippines. What they had were their eyes, the sight of the Princeton burning, and the sounds of battle as the American combat air patrols and strike forces battled the Japanese planes in the air. They were well-coordinated attacks, said Arleigh Burke. In retrospect, the air battle of Task Group 38.3 that day sounds like an easy victory, but nobody thought so at the time. For example, with the Princeton burning, Admiral Halsey had asked Sherman to close up on the task group in the mouth of San Bernardino Strait. For another reason, the Princeton had sent off a strike, and if she moved that far away, her planes might not make it back to her. There were many, many moments of uneasiness that day that do not show in the routine reports. In the meantime, said Arleigh Burke, enemy air attacks were being repelled, a search to the north and northeast with single planes in each subsector. We didn't have many planes in the single task group there. At about 2:30 p.m. we launched an attack into the Sibuyan Sea. In other words, we felt that there were enemy planes to the northeast. We knew that there were enemy planes to the southwest, so we launched every plane that we could get against the fleet that we knew was in the Sibuyan Sea. In the meantime, we sent a very few planes to the northeast in the hopes that they would be able to pick up something. Sure enough, at about 3:40 p.m., those search planes which we had sent to the northeast did contact an enemy force, which was reported as being 3 battleships, half a dozen cruisers, and 6 destroyers. And there was another contact in a different position of 3 carriers, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers, on course west, speed 15. The first of these, of course, was the Matsuda force headed south to undertake the night engagement. The second was the Ozawa force, but of course the Americans did not know this. Indeed, how were they to know that there was not still another force, or even more? Other Japanese vessels were still at home, including several large carriers, and American intelligence did not know that there were no planes for those carriers, or that they were not ready for sea. A lot of guesswork was going on both sides, and that should not be forgotten in assessing the actions of the admirals. At first we thought these reports were of the same group, and then we realized that the pilots which we had sent up got a confirmation from these pilots, and they were positive of what they had cited, and we realized there were actually 2 groups, one a carrier group and one a surface group. Admiral Mitcher and his staff set to work planning what they might do. They were too far from the enemy to make an air attack that afternoon. We made plans to conduct a night attack with the surface forces attached to 38.3 on the enemy carrier task force. Had Mitcher done so, that plan would have meant he sent Admiral Lee with the Massachusetts, South Dakota, Alabama, Washington, and perhaps the cruisers Mobile and Reno up to attack, along with the necessary destroyers. And had he done this, most of the fast battleships would have gone north. In view of the general tactical situation and the probability that such action would upset the plans of Com Third Fleet, this was not done. As sunset approached, the plans of the Third Fleet were crystallizing in flag plot on the New Jersey. Halsey's officers were totaling up everything they had learned during the day. At this time, it was evident that the Japanese Navy was making a major effort, whether for direct attack or transporting troops or both was not apparent. If this was to be an all-out attack by the Japanese fleet, there was one piece missing in the puzzle: the carriers. This referred to an earlier part of the day, before the carriers were found, but this sentence was most significant in view of Halsey's actions. They were believed to have been in the Empire. There had been sightings and intelligence reports which indicated that replenishment measures might have been taken for some important movement from Empire waters. In other words, Halsey did not know the status of the carriers, except that previous experience had always indicated the Japanese carriers were extremely dangerous. Although our submarines stationed in Empire waters had not reported a carrier force, it was felt that they were sure to be employed in some manner in any operation as great as that revealed on the morning of the 24th, so then had come the searches, and the carriers had been found. Commander Third Fleet concluded that the northern force was disposed in two groups, estimated to contain a total of at least 17 ships, and possibly as many as 24 ships. And there was something extremely odd about the whole operation of the Japanese as it unfolded before Halsey's eyes. A curious point was apparent from the contact reports of the three forces. They were all proceeding at deliberate speed, and it was inferred that there was a predetermined focus of geographical location and time. The movements indicated that a carefully worked-out, coordinated Japanese plan was in motion with 25 October as the earliest date of planned concerted action. What Halsey and his staff saw then was the convergence of Kurita, Nishimura, and Ozawa on Leyte Gulf. He did not know about Shima's little force, and the Halsey staff, my brilliant staff he called them affectionately, had put together impressive figures of the damage done to Kurita. Bogen's force, for example, had flown 146 planes off in sorties, dropped 23 tons of bombs and 23 torpedoes. And look what results Bogen claimed. Battleships Yamato, damaged, 3 torpedo hits. Battleships Yamato, damaged, 1 torpedo hit and 2 bombs, possibly same. Battleship Nagato, damaged, 1 torpedo and 1 bomb. Battleship Kongo, damaged, 2 torpedoes and 6 bombs. Cruiser Mogami, damaged, possibly sunk by torpedo cruiser Nachi. Damaged, 1 torpedo cruiser Tone, damaged, 1 torpedo. Here were Admiral Sherman's claims: 1 battleships, damaged badly; 2 battleships, damaged 4 cruisers, damaged 2 light cruiser, damaged. Here were Admiral Davison's claims: 1 battleship Musashi, damaged by torpedo, down by bow, probably sunk; 1 battleship Yamato, damaged, 1 3 torpedoes, 2 bombs; 1 battleship Kongo, damaged, and 1 bomb, 1 cruiser, damaged 1 light cruiser, sunk 1 destroyer, probably sunk 4 destroyers, damaged. Some details, said Halsey's men, were not available at dusk, but flash reports indicated beyond doubt that the centre force had been badly mauled with all of its battleships and most of its cruisers tremendously reduced in fighting power and life. By the evening, Halsey knew that the Kurita force had turned around and was heading once again for San Bernardino Strait. He had now to make a basic decision. The alternatives as he saw them were these: divide the forces, leaving Admiral Lee and the battleships of Task Force 34 to block San Bernardino Strait while the carriers with 2 battleships and the cruisers and destroyers attacked the northern force of Ozawa. But the problem here was that the potential strength of the undamaged northern force was too great to leave unmolested, requiring Task Force 34 to engage the centre force Kurita, while at the same time exposed to attack by land-based and possibly carrier-based air attack was not sound. This alternative spread our strength and risked unprofitable damage in detail. The fact was that Japanese air had shown a remarkable resurgence on October 24, after all that had happened and all that Halsey had been led to expect. He was aware of the Japanese air pipeline technique, of ferrying planes from the home islands to Formosa, and then down to northern Luzon. He did not know how many planes the Japanese had to ferry, or how quickly they were ferrying them, or how many planes Ozawa's carriers had left. Maintain the integrity of the striking force of the Third Fleet, and keep the fleet off San Bernardino Strait, waiting to cover the American position. This permitted the northern force to function as planned unmolested, and because destruction of Japan's carrier force would mean much to future operations, Halsey did not like the idea at all. He knew this is what Spruance would have done: strike the northern force with all of his fleet's strength concentrated and leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded. Halsey liked this plan. It appealed to the fighting admiral in him. It maintained the integrity of his striking fleet. It offered a chance to hit the Japanese hard and surprise, and destroy the enemy carrier force. It was particularly sound and necessary if the strength of the northern force proved to be the maximum reported, and that was a very important matter he did not know. Halsey recognized that the Kurita force might get out of San Bernardino Strait and do some damage, but he held to the idea that he had hurt its fighting power so much that it could never win against what Admiral Kincaid had to throw against the Japanese. And finally, in considering it all, Halsey estimated that the Third Fleet could always return in time to reverse any advantage that Kurita might gain, even if a temporarily tight situation were to develop at Leyte. All this was laid out by the staff as the sun sank, and Halsey pondered. It was his way to let his staff have its say, and the staff spoke up. The Japanese must be making a banzai attack of the kind he had, encountered in the South Pacific so often, obeying an imperial order to do or die. From long experience with the Japanese, their blind adherence to plan, and their inability to readjust disturbed plans, the Commander Third Fleet had long ago adopted a policy of attacking first. The policy had served him well in building morale in the South Pacific and achieving victory there. Now he knew the Japanese were dogged. He did not underestimate the courage of his enemy, just the enemy's judgment. And he decided Commander Third Fleet was convinced that the center force was so heavily damaged that it could not win a decision while the possible maximum strength of the northern force constituted a fresh and powerful threat. It was decided that earliest possible attack on the powerful northern carrier force was essential for breaking up the enemy plan and retaining the initiative. It was a hard decision to make, but Halsey made it, and at 8:32 p.m. he ordered Admiral Mitcher to take command of the 3 carrier groups nearby and attack the enemy carrier force. Admiral McCain and his carrier group were racing to join them. Before darkness fell on October 24, the various unit commanders were all puzzling over the Japanese intentions and the actions that ought to be taken, but in the face of Admiral Halsey's decision, there was not really much that any of them could do. Halsey was in charge, and he had made a decision. Admiral Bogen thought it a wrong decision. He suspected, from the change in Japanese course, that Admiral Kurita was coming through San Bernardino Strait. The intelligence from the night carrier Independence also indicated this, and Halsey had ordered the Independence to have planes in the vicinity of the Kurita force just before dark to shadow the enemy and keep him informed of Japanese movements. That evening the Independence reported the Japanese were on course 120 at 12 knots. That meant they were heading southeast towards San Bernardino Strait. As Bogen feared, at 7:35 p.m., the Independence reported and confirmed it. An hour later, the Independence reported the Japanese fleet off the middle of the west coast of the little island of Boreas, just west of southern Luzon, and then the night carrier planes said the Japanese were moving between Bias and Masbate Islands, coming closer. Admiral Bogen got Captain E.C. Ewan of the Independence on the talk between ships, and Ewan said he was sure the Japanese were coming through the strait. Bogen got a message ready for Halsey, recommended from Leo. Task Force 34, it said, "Leave my group in Popper and let the other 2 groups handle the northern force." He did not send the message just then, although he later said, "I thought that Admiral Halsey was making one hell of a mistake." In talking with Ewan, Bogen learned one salient fact. Although for as long as anyone could remember the Japanese had kept San Bernardino Strait darkened, probably against American submarines, this night navigation lights were all turned on. That certainly meant something to a ship captain. Bogen got the message to the New Jersey by telephone, but was cut off. "Yes, yes," said the voice answering. "We have that information, and nothing was changed. The risk had been calculated. The information that the Japanese were on course 060, which would lead them to the strait, meant nothing any more. Halsey had committed himself. Bogen did not send his message about Task Force 34. On the battleship Washington, Admiral Lee was working out the plot of the enemy force, and before dark he sent a blinker message to Admiral Halsey suggesting that the northern force was a decoy and that the major Japanese effort would come through San Bernardino Strait. The message was confirmed in receipt, but there was no answer. Lee sent one more message by TBS, but it did not affect Halsey's decision. Admiral Kincaid and his commanders of the 7th Fleet had been waiting all day, because theirs was the responsibility to continue supplying and protecting the invasion troops who were making their way across the jungles and mountains of Leyte. Admirals Barbie and Wilkinson were overseeing their sectors. In Barbie's sector, the ships went to general quarters at 8 a.m. on the 24th, because an air raid began. Some 18 Navy fighters were put up by the jeep carriers. A dozen Japanese planes came over, and several of them dropped bombs, 2 of which hit between the Blue Ridge and the landing craft infantry stationed nearby, and 3 more between the Blue Ridge and the Shropshire. There was no damage, and the Americans watched happily as 2 of the Japanese were splashed off Red Beach. It was no picnic off Red Beach or anywhere else that day, and the minimal destruction of American ships by the Japanese perhaps tells the story less accurately than Captain Tarbuck's diary. It was put together very shortly after the events. Enemy dive bombers launch an attack on the starboard bow. All guns open up with a hell of a roar. The Shropshire and a destroyer commence firing also, and the aircraft are turning away. Fighter pilots can be heard over the radio tally-hoing the enemy. 3 planes fall burning, 1 crashes on shore, 1 landing craft infantry bursts into flames from a hit or a suicide plane crash. 1 Liberty ship is hit by a bomb. There is too much smoke to identify ships now, and the burning oil smoke of the landing craft infantry rises 5,000 feet, flames about 200 feet. Our combat air patrol is being relieved by a new group, arriving on station from the escort carriers. The Support aircraft circuit announces the splashing of over 20 enemy planes, and the unloading of men and supplies continued through this hail. That morning, the fleet made smoke to screen itself during the air attack, and then let the smoke die when the attack was over. By afternoon, the 2 landing forces had put ashore 144,000 men and 244,000 tons of supplies and equipment since the beginning of the invasion. The Americans were established and had a tremendous stake on shore, and 141 ships lay in the Gulf, and the Japanese were coming in harder and harder. At 3 p.m. there was another alert, another attack. The sky was spotted with flak, and the small craft were making smoke again. A Betty skidded by the side of the Blue Ridge, Barbie's flagship under fire from a destroyer, and a Zero came by on the port quarter, both unscathed. "The Japanese are getting bolder and the attacks more frequent," Captain Tarbuck noted. But a Hellcat shot 1 Val down in his sight, and then another Val went down. By 3 p.m. the men of the fleet were learning that a battle was brewing, with ships coming in from both the Sulu Sea and Mindoro Strait. The Japanese air attacks continued, and as the day wore on, the smoke over the Gulf became so intense that when explosions were heard, usually on the Blue Ridge, no one could guess what they might be. At 6:45 the moon began rising in its first quarter, and then 9 Japanese planes came in through the murk, most of them to be shot down by the American fighters. The word had been passed by Admiral Kincaid's staff that Admiral Halsey was aware of all their dangers, and that the new battleships had been formed into a task force to guard San Bernardino Strait, while Admiral Oldendorf's bombardment battleships of older vintage, and cruisers and destroyers and PT boats should be available to stop the Japanese in Surigao Strait. The Americans in the Gulf were not unduly worried. General Kruger, commander of 6th Army, went ashore at 6:55 p.m. to assume command of the Central Philippine Attack Force, and thus to relieve Admiral Kincaid of the land portion of his responsibility. Now, all day long on October 24, Admiral Kincaid had been studying the situation from his flag plot in the Wasatch. At 3:12 p.m., His staff intercepted the dispatch that Halsey sent out with his battle plan for the formation of Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee. Had Halsey known of the eagerness and interest with which this dispatch was read aboard the Wasatch, he undoubtedly would have gained an insight into Admiral Kincaid's thinking that he did not have. Kincaid and his officers were delighted with the Halsey plan, as much as any commander could ever do under any circumstances. Kincaid was able to put the danger of the Kurita force out of his mind and concentrate on the problem he faced from the south, where Nishimura and Shima were moving up through the Sulu Sea. Admiral Kincaid had a very good idea that the Japanese of the Nishimura force were relatively unhurt, even though the planes of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had indicated serious damage. But he had all day to worry about that problem too, he planned, carefully, and at 2:30 p.m. ordered Rear Admiral Oldendorf to prepare for a probable night engagement. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf was already making preparations for a fight, because Kincaid was a thorough man, and just after noon he had declared the possibilities to his ships, every one of them. When the order came to prepare, it too was done with Kincaid's usual care. The fighting ships made quite a formidable force. They included the battleships, 6 of them, 8 cruisers, 26 destroyers, and 39 PT boats. Admiral Oldendorf had been waiting. He, like everyone else, expected a Japanese attack of some kind on the American forces in the Gulf. When the word came, things began to happen. The amphibious flagships closed up on the Liberty ships and lesser vessels in San Pedro Bay. The flagships were marvelous vessels, triumphs of communications genius, but except for anti-aircraft weapons, they were unfit to defend themselves. You could not have everything on one ship, and long ago the American Navy had learned that a commander of an amphibious force was better off in a special ship than in a battleship or cruiser with guns belting down the communications every few minutes. The cruiser Nashville was also stationed near these ships, for it bore precious cargo indeed, General MacArthur. What the Japanese would not give to kill or capture MacArthur. To do so would almost have been worth any price that the show operation cost. All concerned were aware of the necessity of keeping a special eye on the Nashville and the ships around her. A close screen of destroyers was thrown around these ships to protect them at all costs, and so there would be no mistakes about friends and foes. Admiral Kincaid said that all ship movements into and out of Leyte Gulf would end at sunset. Yes, Oldendorf was waiting. He had not been fooled by the apparent ease with which they had landed the forces on the beaches of Leyte. He expected light, fast forces of the Japanese to try to interfere with the transports. Indeed, for 4 nights he had kept his battleships south of the transports, guarding the southern entrance to Leyte Gulf, and his cruisers had been off to port of the battleships. He had not been sleeping at the switch. Rear Admiral R.S. Berkey's close covering group, originally made up of 4 cruisers and several destroyers, was closer in to the transports. Berkey had been reduced by 1 cruiser when the Australia took that diving plane early in the operation, but was still strong enough in force for the job to be done, so the southern group reported, Oldendorf prepared. When this group was reported, Admiral Kincaid directed me to prepare for a night engagement, and battle plans were drawn so that a night action could be fought with an enemy coming through Surigao Strait from the south, or attempting to enter Surigao Strait from the Pacific to the east. One thing to remember in reading about these battles is the huge question mark in the mind of every commander as to the intentions of his enemy. Knowing now what the Japanese were doing and why, a writer can speak glibly, but in study of the materials of war, it is apparent that much more was guessed, sometimes rightly and sometimes wrongly, by commanders on both sides than was ever known to them by observation. Admiral Oldendorf did not know as of the afternoon of October 24 just what the Japanese were going to do. He merely had some very strong suspicions and acted on them. As information continued to come in, it was manifest that the southern force was actually going to attempt to penetrate the strait, although it was greatly inferior in size and strength to the force under my command. Admiral Oldendorf prepared his battle plan unhurriedly, and sent copies of it over to Rear Admiral G.L. Weiler, who was in command of the battleships, and to Rear Admiral R.S. Berkey in the Phoenix, who was to command the right flank forces. Facing Surigao Strait, which runs between Leyte and Dinagat Islands, there were destroyers on the right flank against Leyte, and destroyers on the left flank, off Dinagat. Facing the strait, there were Berkey's cruisers on the right flank, next to Leyte, and Oldendorf's own cruisers on the left flank, next to and behind Little Hyberson Island, which juts off Dinagat. Behind were the big battleships, thus protected and able to fire over the lesser ships very easily. Admiral Weiler was the commander of the battle line. Under him was Rear Admiral T.D. Ruddock, who led Battleship Division 4, and Rear Admiral T.E. Chandler, who led Battleship Division 2. Assisting Oldendorf directly, in charge of Cruiser Division 12, was Rear Admiral R.W. Haler. The Americans had enough admirals involved in the battle so that no matter what happened, there could not be a breakdown in command. The force was ready and in position by darkness on October 24, but since Admiral Kincaid and his commanders knew that Admiral Halsey was planning to form Task Force 34, the new battleship force, to guard San Bernardino Strait, there was no nervousness when, just before 8:30 p.m., Kincaid learned that Halsey was moving north with 3 task groups to attack the enemy northern force led by Admiral Ozawa. Kincaid was much more concerned with his own problems. The battleships were going up and down at the head of the strait, cruisers and destroyers at bow and stern, and it seemed that everyone was eager. When Kincaid had sent out the call for PT boats that afternoon, the lamentable report came back that only about 20 of the 50 boats in the fleet were available for action. The others were down with sick engines or something equally serious. But then, when the commanders learned that there was going to be a fight that night, or that there was likely to be a fight, suddenly those engines improved and the number of available boats doubled. The American admirals of the Oldendorf unit knew exactly what they were going to do. Weiler and Berkey had come aboard the Louisville to discuss their problems, the most important of which was that they were heavily laden with explosive ammunition and lightly stacked with armor-piercing shells. Actually, the battleships averaged about enough armor-piercing shells for 5 salvos. These would have to be saved for enemy battleships. Nothing less than armor-piercing would stop them, so some careful spotting and calculation was in order. Also, the admirals agreed to hold fire until the Japanese battleships came within 20,000 yards. There were a few other little problems. The destroyers were short on torpedoes, and no replacements were available, and the destroyers had used up most of their 5-inch ammunition against the beaches, so they had about 20% left. But the battleships had an automatic position, at the head of the Gulf, that admirals had fought for dozens of times before, the position of crossing the T. The idea of crossing the T is that one force of ships would steam along faster than its opponent, maybe having the weather gauge in the old days, and then would cut sharply across the bow well ahead of the enemy force, so that all the guns on one side of the battle force could bear on each one of the enemy ships in turn as it came along, being the body of the T, while the crossing ships were the top or cross. The American force was arranged across the mouth of Surigao Strait like the cross of the T, just waiting for the body of the T to join. The poor body was in for a frightful time. First, in the strait, even as far away as the Mindanao Sea, the torpedo boats would attack with torpedoes. Second, the destroyers of right and left flanks would rush forward and attack from each side. And third, the cruisers and battleships would take the enemy under fire as each ship steamed forward to help make that T. Admiral Oldendorf was not crossing the T, he was making the T. My theory, he was to say later, was that of the old-time gambler. Never give a sucker an even break. If my opponent is foolish enough to come at me with an inferior force, I'm certainly not going to give him an even break. So it was a confident American force that waited for the Japanese to come up, and added to it was the force of Destroyer Squadron 54, 7 new destroyers itching to get into the fight, under Captain J.B. Coward. They were detailed to guard the southern force, but Captain Coward asked for permission to join the battle, and Admiral Oldendorf gave it to him. As for the Japanese, on October 24, they were moving into very much of a void, and even among those who were to strike through the Sulu Sea, there was much confusion and very little information exchanged. Take, for example, the case of Japanese Destroyer Division 23, which was detailed as a part of the Shima striking force. While waiting in those days when all the forces were converging on Leyte Gulf, Destroyer Division 23 was ordered to Takao in Formosa to bring base equipment and personnel for the 2nd Air Fleet. Admiral Fukudome's organization, which was hoping to throw its strength into the balance and secure mastery of the air. This division consisted of the destroyers Wakaba, Hatsuharu, and Hatsushimo, and what happened to it is among the sad little stories of the Japanese show operation. The destroyers loaded the 2nd Air Fleet components and set out for Manila, arriving on the afternoon of October 23. They were to unload, refuel, and move out to join up as quickly as they could, but the Hatsushimo was delayed in refueling, and so the division was held up in Manila Bay until 9:25 p.m. on the 23rd. On the morning of October 24, Admiral Davison's planes found the destroyers on their way and attacked. One plane bombed the Wakaba, the flagship, and with one bomb and a near miss by another plane, the Wakaba became unnavigable and sank just before 9 a.m. The Hatsuharu became the division flagship. She picked up a handful of survivors from the flagship, 5 officers and 73 petty officers and men, and moved south on course 160 degrees. Then, at 11:52 a.m., more enemy planes attacked Hatsushimo, and one bomb on the port side damaged the ship badly, but she could make full speed. Still more planes came in, and there was a bloody battle in which the Japanese claimed to have shot down several American planes. The end result was that the 2 remaining destroyers reversed course and headed back to Manila Bay, arriving at 1 p.m. on October 25. They had been very definitely driven out of the battle by the carrier planes, and the damage to them, which was included in the overall picture, was part of the confusion, because these ships had never figured in the estimates of the forces sighted. In other words, here were 3 Japanese warships that had not been counted in the sightings, but 2 of them were most definitely countable in the damage count, and the reports simply served to add emphasis to the blow struck the Japanese fleet, and to convince Halsey that he had indeed hit hard. After all, counting these ships, the Japanese had no fewer than 5 forces at sea, 4 of them coming from the west. It was small wonder that there was confusion. Following the attack by American planes on the morning of October 24, Admiral Nishimura's 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers steamed steadily on towards Surigao Strait. The American attack set fire to the afterdeck of the battleship Fuso, as noted, wrecked an observation plane there, and caused damage below decks. But the damage was not serious enough to stop the Fuso or the force, and Nishimura steamed on. Some of his men thought the Americans were specifically diving at their planes, for the Mogami's aircraft deck had been strafed before the Americans flew away at about 10 a.m. Some officers in the Nishimura force were aware of Thew Hall's show plan, and they believed that Admiral Nishimura and Admiral Shima ought to get together and go into Surigao Strait as a unit, but Japanese naval discipline was such that they said nothing. Nishimura was older than Shima and had more naval and battle experience. In spite of that, Shima was his superior. This had led to personal bitterness, and yet the Japanese of this force were confident of victory. They had been told by their superiors that they had a force equal to the Americans, except perhaps in the matter of heavy cruisers, and they fully expected that the balance was evenly matched by the natural superiority of the Japanese fighting man.